Hello, everybody. I would like to talk about wisdom in science and the introduction to the electric sun theory. In this talk, I would like to do a comparison between wisdom and knowledge. I will introduce you to a historical scientific case study of how wisdom comes into play in scientific advancement. And the introduction to the electric sun theory, we go into a brief general overview of how electric sun works in terms of concepts, but not going to much details in technical perspective. And then followed by conclusion. First, we need to understand the difference between knowledge and wisdom. What we do in this world today in scientific community is called knowledge. The knowledge is information of which someone is aware, and of course the knowledge is subjective. It's used for a specific purpose to solve some certain problems. And in terms of time, the knowledge is subject to change due to new information that arise or new way to analyze the data, and always seek for improvement. And of course, the way we obtain knowledge is from internet, from conventional education, and of course the science itself. On the other hand, wisdom is ability to make the right or correct judgment and decision. In order to do that, we have to understand the law of nature pretty well. And of course, the law of nature does not change with time, so it's timeless. And the source of wisdom we can obtain, in Buddhism, we call it vipassana meditation. And there's some other different ways to obtain wisdom as well. Let's talk about really basic understanding of how a scientific theory is created. As we know from all of many textbooks, it starts with observation, then comes with hypothesis. With the hypothesis, we can create an experiment that actually tests what we believe a certain object works, and then we come into a conclusion. And of course, all of this is controlled by assumptions. Assumptions sets what type of hypothesis we're going to use. Assumption also defines the experiment, how we're setting it up, as well as the conclusion. And if something goes wrong, people typically go to change hypothesis. Sometimes assumptions can remain the same. And of course, everything in this creation is based on perceptions. The view of such person create the way we observe the object. We can look at objects with different perceptions, and we see different results. And the wisdom is the part of about understanding the whole process of how everything works and how everything is connected together, and also aware that whatever we do is subject to each perceptions and is also bound by assumptions. And of course, when we look at one thing, you have one theory with different perception. You have theory number 2, number 3, and number 4, and so forth. And of course, wisdom and knowledge are different. So knowledge is just part of the thing that we try to solve. So how do we know we have the right perceptions if you want to solve the problem efficiently? Of course, from this picture here, you can see that the objects can be viewed from different perception. It's like we're projecting the light into the object, and what we see from that shadow reflects what object is from that perception. And of course, one perception may not be enough to understand the subject that we study. Of course, and we need the right perceptions to efficiently solve the problem, and the right perceptions will lead to the right intention, the right speech, right action, the right livelihood, right efforts, right mindfulness, and the right concentration. And this is one of the fundamental core of the Buddhism teaching called the Eightfold Path. So let's talk about the historical scientific case study. In this case, we study the Venus orbit. So as people already know how the orbits work, but at the old days, when we don't have much instruments, we look at the sky and see the star moving in the sky, and we have Earth as a point of observations. So it's quite straightforward to assume that Earth is the center of everything that's in the space. So in this case, we assume the Earth is the center of the solar system. So it's really a commonly accepted idea during that time. And of course, scientists that in the old day can make a really precise measurements of the Venus position surrounding the Earth over time, and able to create a map of orbital paths of Venus. So the mathematicians are very smart, come up with a really complex equation to explain it. But of course, nobody else outside the society will understand what it means. So the problem becomes very complex and is highly confined to the object of study by itself. So by just shifting the perceptions, assuming that the Earth is no longer a center of the rotation of the other objects, and we use the sun instead, everything become simplified, and all those theory of planetary orbits in the solar system can be applied not only for Venus but for other planets as well. So from here you can see the major point of observation is that the problem can be solved by introducing an alternative perception, not by sustaining the same perceptions or reinforcing it. The solution becomes simple and easy to understand by common people, just like us. Solution also can solve multiple problems at the same time. It solve other problems as well. So that's a good thing. And this is how the science should work, is in the efficient way. And of course, through the history of mankind, there are always a resistance to changes or changing the perceptions of belief. And of course, that could cause slowdown in scientific advancement. Now, to be able to solve problem in generally and globally for this universe, we have to understand how the universe works, and it works through the law of nature. So in this law of nature, I would like to introduce you to the Buddha teaching called dependent origination. And there's a lot of details into this, but the main conclusion is that everything is interdependence. So interdependence causations, there are multiple causes and conditions of how things can occur. It doesn't occur by chance or random. If we know the cause and we can trace all the factors that become something to occur, then we should be able to understand and make the right decision about that object. And of course, another teaching in Buddhism is called three marks of existence. And this is very important it states that nothing can remain absolutely certain and is subject to change. Or in the teaching, direct teaching is called impermanent. So if everything is in a state of changing, even space, which scientific community assume is electrically neutral, is actually an impermanent state. So neutral is also impermanent. And since everything is ever changing, we call that suffering, because it's someday it's gonna dies down, just like stars. All the planets someday has to die. And of course, if everything is changing all the time and it's dying and then it goes away, there'll be no self in it, or it's this concept called selflessness. And I can compare this to one of the experiments in the electric sun theory later on. So in this case study, we'd like to introduce to electric sun theory. This theory is very useful in terms of making us understand about the different perceptions in how we actually study the sun. And if you look at the sun from this perspective, just like in this picture, you can see that it's actually a bright object in the sky. And a lot of questions will arise on what that thing really is, such as what powers the sun, where its energy comes from, and then leads to what trigger all those solar activities. And when we understand this, we can actually do some predictions, and we know when the next eruption will be. So perceptions is the thing that we actually want to emphasize, because perception will define the direction of the solution to the problems. And that's also ties to personal experience. If you are born really in the old ages during the caveman period, we may think as something hot in the sky is really similar analogy to a fire. You need a fuel to supply it and to keep it sustain the heat. And of course, newer, we think of some nuclear scientists believe that the sun is a thermonuclear reactor. So it produces not just heat but also radiation. And of course, if it goes into a different perspective from electrical engineer perspective, such as Nikola Tesla, we think that of course the sun is driven by electric, or the frequency and vibrations that actually govern the whole universe. So we have different perspective and concept of how we understand how that object work. So now let's take a look at the energy source that powers the sun. When we look at the sun, we see it as we can also see it as a living organism, because it produces all the activities all the time. It doesn't seem to die down permanently. It comes and go. It has a cycle, and these cycles have different activities. So we have to raise the question, such as, where does energy come from that all power all these things? Is energy come from inside, or energy come from the outside? In modern scientific communities typically have an impression that energy comes from inside the sun. But how do we know if that's actually true? If you look at ourselves, the body of ourselves is hot compared to the environment. And we see that it's all activities come from human, walking around doing all kind of things all the time. It has cycle as well, just like the sun. We have sleep cycle and activity cycles. And of course, we ask ourselves, where does energy come from this human? And of course, the answer is, does it actually come from inside the human by itself? You can say that the answer is no. We rely on air surrounding to keep sustaining the combustion inside, right? To create energy. We rely on food that comes from the outside that we need to consume. So you need to consume something in order to generate energy. And of course, if we want to ask some scientists about how the sun works, the easiest way to think of is this picture here, that we have a heat coming from a gas stove, boiling water, really hot, so it's boiling hot, become bubble, and you got pop and all kinds of activity we see on the surface. And of course, in this assumptions is that the energy gradients is that the energy is the hottest part will be from the inside, and the most outside is the coolest. Or we can switch assumptions that energy actually powering the sun come from the outside, through this experiment which I will show you later on. So of course there's a consequence if you decide to think or to make a conclusion that energy come from inside the sun, which is the theory that we conventionally use today, and you can find that in Wikipedia. There's such assumption assume that energy comes from inside the sun, of course, and it comes and the sun just appear here and live here for a long period of time and is subject to decay. Of course, I can agree with that. But of course, if energy comes from inside, there's always being a decaying mode, so it's always dying. And all those activities on the surface is some kind of chaotic, and it's a result of thermal convection from the inside. So some kind of energy propagate from the inside to the outside. Of course, by doing that, there's a consequence, and there's a lot of consequence as well. As we do a lot of research about the sun, we have found a lot of unexplained phenomenon based on such assumption, such as missing neutrinos. The rate of generation of neutrinos is actually inversely proportional to sunspot, and the generation is actually much less than calculated, assuming the energy comes from the inside. The temperature of the hollow light corona is 300 times the that of the surface, so the outside is hotter than the surface. There's a the rotates faster at the equator on the surface. So this is for the sun. The solar wind accelerate upon leaving the sun. The sunspot also reveal cooler interior, of course, because sunspot is black compared to its surrounding, and sunspot travel faster than surrounding surface. And there's a lot of long list that's going on as a consequence of using such assumptions. But how do we actually solve problem more efficiently? Just like before, we have to change the perception. So that we change the perception so that we look at if the sun energy come from the outside. Of course, there's a lot of more problems, such as if we use the same assumption, is that why the sun's size remain constant if it should be actively decaying, and we cannot explain that either. Or in other systems such as Jenny, the expansion and contraction of this object is so fast in a matter of days or months, which is really hard to explain using a conventional thermonuclear fusion physics. So there's a lot of question can arise from try to enforce such assumption, and of course creating problem afterward. If you ask astronauts about smell in space, he will say that it smells like arc welding torch repairing heavy equipment. So if you look at this energy source of arc welding, you can see that this equipment is powered by electric. So it's quite straightforward answer. If we look into the way we try to create nuclear fusion using the device called tokamak, the way they create energy is that first they have to plug all this instrument into electrical outlets so that electrical energy can be used to create a microwave frequency, creating vibration and causing plasma generation inside this toroid area volume. So of course you can see electricity everywhere we try to do experiments relating to the sun and other places as well. So it's quite a common sense to use electricity to help explain a lot of things that's going on in space. Of course, and one of those founding father of electric universe is Christine Berglund. He used electricity to simulate the rings surrounding planets, just like the one in Saturn. Also, a lot of activities representing solar activities, all using electricity to make this experiment happen. And of course, and the way to demonstrate that electricity can be used to generate a plasma sphere can be shown in this video. It's called 5-minute fusor. You can find this on YouTube, and I can just go through our video real quick. So in this video, we use electrostatic electricity, or in this case we use high voltage power to drive the electrodes inside the tube, and this tube will be pumped out so that it creates a vacuum environment similar to space, so there'll be less gas volume inside. That's easy to create plasma. So watch this carefully. As you can see here, we have two electrodes, one connected to the ball, the other side is connected to a plate. As we pump the air out, the plasma balls start to create around the center of the sphere. And you can see that this is how you can create a plasma ball. And the reason we see the color is because the gas emit color differently. In this case, it's not hydrogen. And as you can see, it looks spherical, just like the sun. It seems like it's emitting energy coming out from the sphere. And from here, you can see that you can clearly say that the energy of the sphere does not come from inside the sphere, for sure. It comes from the outside. So if you or us as an observer at the sun and we see a bright sphere in the sky, we can't say that energy comes from the sphere itself, because everything else surrounding us is invisible, just like electricity in the air is invisible. So if you watch this one a little more careful, you will start to see the change in the brightness of the sphere. And you can see a lot of activities start to show up in this sphere. And that's due to the composition or the charge density surrounding this sphere is different. So you can see that the outside electrodes start to grow as well. So everything works together as one system, just not the sphere itself, but also the whole entire experiments. So when the vacuum density change, of course the brightness change and the activity change. So this is how we explain externally driven sun. So in this case, if we compare that to the real sun, we can see on the top picture on your right, you see some bright filament pointing out from the sun. It's just like the way it happened in fusion neutron generator in a similar fashion. And of course, from this observation, we found that the energy did not come from inside the plasma spherical ball. And those plasma activities around the ball changed due to external influences. And of course, we can clearly say that there's no self in this plasma ball. The plasma ball cannot sustain itself, it relies on energy from the surrounding to create it at the beginning. And of course, there's a process to sustain such thing. And we take a look at how we compare that to solar minimum and maximum. This is just a possible explanation. Of course, it needs a lot more study about it. During the high pressure time, we see a lot of activities as filaments like surrounding this plasma sphere ball compared to when it's low pressure. So the glow become more uniform. If you compare that to during the solar activity time, you see that there's a lot of activities during solar maximum, and there's not much during solar minimum, even though the shapes remain really the same. So it looks like a solid object that we actually studying. Of course, so this is just one explanation of how solar activity cycles work. Is that the solar activity cycles work because the way the sun interacts with its environment change periodically, just like the Earth has the season, which is due to the interaction between Earth and the sun. Of course, it's not just the Earth by itself that have each season by its own, but it's due to the interaction. The same analogies go with the sun, where we have 11-year cycle, and we also have cycles of low activities than usual, and that time resulting in mini ice age that occurred in the past. And that also explained that the energies around the Earth also become less, so it become cooler. Of course, everything is subject to change because this is science, but I would like to show this as an alternative explanation to the mainstream science, that we can see things in a much simpler way and not too complicated to understand for general people. And of course, the conclusion is that the knowledge alone cannot help advancing science. The knowledge can help advance science, but it could be in a really incremental step, but not a giant leaps in advancement. Because wisdom is required in any scientific developments to maintain a balanced view of the problem and to make the right research decision. And there's much more that anyone can draw conclusion from this based on our own wisdom. Thank you very much for listening to this. With the hypothesis, we can create an experiment that actually tests what we believe a certain object works, and then become into a conclusion. And of course, all of this is controlled by assumptions. Assumptions sets what type of hypothesis we're going to use. Assumption also defines the experiment, how we're setting it up, as well as the conclusion. If something goes wrong, people typically go to change hypothesis. Sometimes assumptions can remain the same. And of course, everything in this creation is based on perception. The view of such person create the way. Hello everybody. I would like to talk about wisdom in science and the introduction to the electric sun theory. In this talk, I would like to do a comparison between wisdom and knowledge. I will introduce you to a historical scientific case study of how wisdom comes into play in scientific advancement. And the introduction to the electric sun theory, we go into a brief general overview of how electric sun works in terms of concepts, but not going to much details in technical perspective. And then followed by conclusion. First, we need to understand to make the right or correct judgment and decision. In order to do that, we have to understand the law of nature pretty well. And of course, the law of nature does not change with time, so it's timeless. And the source of wisdom we can obtain, in Buddhism, we call it vipassana meditation. And there's some other different ways to obtain wisdom as well. Let's talk about really basic understanding of how a scientific theory is created. As we know from all of many textbooks, it starts with observation, then comes with hypothesis. We observe the object. We can look at objects with different perceptions, and we see different results. And the wisdom is the part of about understanding the whole process of how everything works and how everything is connected together, and also aware that whatever we do is subject to each perceptions and is also bound by assumptions. And of course, when we look at one thing, you have one theory with different perception. You have theory number 2, number 3, and number 4, and so forth. And of course, wisdom and knowledge are different. So, and the difference between knowledge and wisdom, what we do in this world today in scientific community is called knowledge. The knowledge is information of which someone is aware, and of course, the knowledge is subjective. It's used for a specific purpose to solve some certain problems. And in terms of time, the knowledge is subject to change due to new information that arise or new way to analyze the data, and always seek for improvement. And of course, the way we obtain knowledge is from internet, from conventional education, and of course the science itself. On the other hand, wisdom is ability